Hello there, and welcome back to the Sleepy Nova Chronicles. Right now, on a high mountain somewhere above you, a snowflake that fell this morning has not melted. Not because the temperature is exceptional. Not because this particular flake landed on cold rock, or in deep shade, or in any special location that preserved it beyond its normal season. But because it landed on the previous winter's snow, on the compressed, granular, not-quite ice layer that has been accumulating in this specific basin, on this specific north-facing slope, at this specific altitude, summer after summer and winter after winter for the last several hundred years. And because the summer that came this year was not quite warm enough, quite long enough, quite sunny enough to melt the full accumulation from the winter before. One flake surviving one summer. That is how a glacier begins. Not with a catastrophe. Not with an ice age or a volcanic winter or a dramatic shift in the orbital mechanics of the Earth around the Sun. With a single failure of a single summer to fully complete its annual work. With a patch of snow in a mountain basin that should have melted by August still sitting, grey and granular and slightly embarrassed looking, in October. With that patch surviving the following winter beneath new snow and emerging the following spring as the faintest, most provisional, most geologically tentative archive of cold that the landscape has produced in that location in a generation. The glacier is born in patience. Its entire life, from that first surviving patch through the centuries of accumulation that will eventually produce something large enough and deep enough to begin moving under its own weight, is a story of patience so complete, so unhurried, so indifferent to the urgency of the human timescale that it makes every other slow process we have encountered in these gentle journeys seem, by comparison, almost hasty. The glacier moves at the speed of deep time. And this is the misconception to release tonight. Not gently, this time, but with the specific, satisfying solidity of a fact that reorients everything that follows it. The misconception is that a glacier is simply a large piece of ice. A frozen river. A static thing that exists in cold places and melts when the climate warms and is, in essence, a passive object in the landscape. Sitting there, being cold, doing nothing in particular until it either grows or shrinks depending on the weather. It is not passive. It is not static. It is not doing nothing. A glacier is one of the most powerful geological forces on the surface of the Earth. The agent responsible for carving approximately 3/4 of the world's mountain scenery, for excavating the lake basins that hold the majority of the world's surface fresh water, for grinding the bedrock of entire continents into the fine mineral dust that became the fertile soils of the temperate regions that feed most of the human race. The glacier does not sit in the landscape. The glacier builds the landscape. And it does this with a combination of patience and power that is, once you understand the mechanism, one of the most extraordinary demonstrations of what happens when an enormous amount of weight is applied to a surface over an enormous amount of time. Not the weight of a mountain falling on a plain. Not the sudden, violent, energy-releasing force of an earthquake or an eruption. The weight of ice. Cold, slow, inexorable, applying its pressure continuously, without pause, without urgency, without any awareness of the landscape it is reshaping, 1 millimeter at a time, 1 year at a time, 1 century at a time. The force is not dramatic. The force is patient. And patience, applied with sufficient weight over sufficient time, achieves what no dramatic force ever could. Not the sudden fracture of a struck surface, but the complete, smooth, polished transformation of a landscape from what it was into something entirely new. Something that bears, in every valley and every lake and every U-shaped trough and every erratic boulder deposited far from its parent rock, the specific, indelible, centuries-long signature of the ice that made it. 60% of the world's fresh water is currently locked in glacial ice. 60%. If you took all the water in all the rivers and all the lakes and all the reservoirs and all the groundwater aquifers of the entire world and added them together, you would have approximately 40% of the fresh water that the glaciers of Antarctica and Greenland and the world's mountain ranges are currently holding in cold storage. Everything your civilization runs on, every river that turns a turbine, every reservoir that supplies a city, every aquifer that irrigates a field, represents the 40%. The glaciers hold the majority. The water you will drink in the next decade has quite possibly been ice for the last 10,000 years. Locked in a glacier that began as a patch of snow that survived a summer somewhere between the last ice age and this morning, accumulating in the specific way that only glaciers accumulate. One layer at a time, one winter at a time, each layer compressing the one below it, the weight of the new snow driving out the air pockets in the old snow, converting the light and fluffy and ephemeral into the dense and blue and ancient. Tonight we are going to follow the glacier, from the single snowflake that begins the process, through the slow compression that converts snow into ice, through the mechanics of how ice flows, through the specific, extraordinary work that glaciers do to the landscapes they inhabit, through the crisis that is reshaping every glacier on Earth at speeds that the ice has not experienced in human memory, to the place where all of it arrives in you. In the water your body contains. In the mineral fertility of the soil that grew your food. In the specific carved landscape you may have looked at in a photograph and felt, without knowing why, that it was telling you something about patience and scale and the specific geological beauty of a world that is always, slowly, becoming something new. If this slow journey into the birth and the life and the extraordinary geological work of the world's glaciers is useful to you tonight, a quiet hour of cold patience and deep time and the specific, unhurried, ancient process of snow becoming ice and ice becoming landscape, then I would gently invite you to subscribe, or to leave a thought below about which part of this stays with you. It helps other people who are lying in their own warmth above glacially carved landscapes, also trying to let the day's speed dissolve into something slower and older, find their way here. One snowflake at a time. But for now, there is only this. Allow your shoulders to soften. Let your breathing slow, not controlled, not pushed toward any particular rhythm, just allowed to find the pace it finds when nothing is demanding urgency. The pace of snow accumulating on a mountain slope in the dark. Quiet, layer by layer, unhurried, each flake arriving in its own time and settling where the air places it and beginning, from the moment of its landing, the slow process of becoming part of something larger. You are the snowflake that has landed. The accumulation begins now. Let's begin. Snow is not ice. This distinction, obvious in its surface form but profound in its mechanical implications, is the foundation of everything that makes glaciers possible, and the first thing to understand about how a glacier is born. The snowflake that falls from a cloud and lands on the accumulation zone of a high mountain is composed of ice crystals. Yes, the same molecular compound, H2O, in its solid state. But its structure is almost entirely air. A freshly fallen snowpack is between 90 and 95% air by volume. 1 cubic meter of fresh powder snow weighs between 50 and 150 kilograms, depending on the conditions of its formation. 1 cubic meter of glacial ice weighs approximately 917 kilograms. The difference between 50 to 150 kilograms per cubic meter and 917 kilograms per cubic meter is the story of a glacier's birth. The transformation of that air-rich, light, structurally delicate snowflake into the dense, blue, crystalline glacial ice that carves valleys and grinds bedrock is not a simple matter of freezing more deeply. It is a process of progressive compression and recrystallization that takes, under typical alpine conditions, between 25 and hundreds of years to complete, and that produces, at each stage of the transformation, a material with fundamentally different physical properties from the material it was before. The first stage is firn. When a layer of fresh snow survives its first summer without melting completely, it is compacted by the weight of the winter's new snow above it and modified by the specific physical processes of metamorphism that operate within a snowpack. The sublimation and redeposition of water vapor within the pack, the rounding of the original snowflake's sharp crystal arms into the more compact granular form that reduces the pack's surface area and allows its grains to settle more densely together, the partial melting and refreezing at the grain boundaries that begins to weld individual crystals into a continuous solid matrix. The surviving snow has become firn. Firn, from the German for last year's snow, is the intermediate material between fresh snow and glacial ice. It is granular. Its grains are rounded, between 1 and 3 millimeters in diameter, visible to the naked eye in a freshly exposed section of a firn layer. It is still relatively porous. Air can still move through a firn layer, and the firn's density, at approximately 500 to 800 kilograms per cubic meter, is still well below that of ice. But it has lost the delicate, branching, symmetrical structure of the original snowflake. It has been compressed and recrystallized into something more uniform, more dense, more patient. Something that is beginning to forget it was ever a snowflake. Over the following years, as more winters deposit more snow above the firn layer, as the weight above it increases and the pressure on each firn grain multiplies, the transformation continues. The air pockets between the firn grains are progressively closed off. The grains grow larger through the Ostwald ripening process, the specific physical phenomenon in which the molecules at the surface of larger crystals are more stable than the molecules at the surface of smaller ones. So material migrates from smaller crystals to larger ones, and the average crystal size increases over time, driven by nothing more than the thermodynamic preference for stability. The firn is becoming ice. Not dramatically. Not in any single moment that you could point to and say, "There, that was the instant of transformation." Gradually, continuously, in the specific way that all of the deep transformations in the Earth's geology happen, by the accumulation of incremental changes that are individually imperceptible and collectively, across sufficient time, complete. At approximately 50 to 100 meters of depth, under the weight of approximately 50 to 100 meters of accumulated snow and firn above, the last air pockets in the firn are closed off. The material has become impermeable to air. The crystals have grown large enough, and the grain boundaries have become intimate enough that the material behaves as a continuous solid rather than an aggregate of grains. The firn has become ice. The glacier has been born. Detectives looking at the specific depth at which the firn-to-ice transition occurs in different glaciers around the world, using ice cores drilled from the accumulation zones, revealed something that connects the birth of the glacier to the specific climate of the location where it forms. The depth of the firn-to-ice transition varies from approximately 30 meters in the cold, dry interior of Antarctica, where accumulation rates are so low that the firn takes centuries to reach the transition depth, to as little as 10 meters in the warmer, wetter conditions of the Norwegian coast, where high accumulation rates drive the firn down to the transition depth in decades. A crystal the size of a sugar cube. The monster of glacial physics is not the glacier's size, not the 3 million cubic kilometers of ice in the East Antarctic ice sheet, which is the largest single body of ice on Earth, covering approximately 14 million square kilometers and in places more than 4 kilometers thick. The monster is the transformation, the specific physical process by which the insubstantial, air-rich, 80% empty snowflake is converted, by weight and time and the thermodynamic preference for larger crystals over smaller ones, into the dense, blue, 900 kilogram per cubic meter material that carves mountains and holds 2.7 million years of climate history in its crystal structure. The monster is what patience does to snow. Now consider what the ice does once it has been born. Once the firn-to-ice transition has been completed, and the mass of ice in the accumulation zone has grown thick enough and heavy enough that something new becomes possible. Something that snow cannot do and firn cannot do. Something that requires the specific material properties of glacial ice, its density, its crystal structure, its specific response to pressure, to be operative before it can begin. The ice begins to move. Not because it melts. Not because the surface it sits on becomes lubricant. Because ice, under sufficient pressure, deforms plastically. The crystal lattice of each ice grain sliding along specific crystallographic planes in response to the applied stress. The individual grains rotating and recrystallizing in new orientations that accommodate the imposed deformation. The whole mass flowing in the direction of the pressure gradient with a specific, viscous, non-Newtonian behavior of a solid that has been given enough weight and time to discover that it is, at some level, a very slow fluid. The threshold pressure for plastic deformation in glacial ice is approximately 100 kilopascals, the pressure produced by approximately 10 meters of ice. 10 meters. A glacier that is 10 meters thick at its center, 10 meters of accumulated, compressed, Fian-converted ice, has already crossed the threshold for plastic deformation. The ice at the base of that 10-meter column is already flowing, invisibly slowly, in the direction the slope dictates. The glacier is already moving, even when it is only 10 meters deep, even when nothing on its surface gives any indication of movement, even when a person standing on it would feel nothing unusual beneath their feet, would feel only the cold hardness of the ice and the specific, compressed silence of a surface that has been accumulating for decades, and that is, beneath that stillness, doing something that the laws of physics have been waiting for it to do since the first surviving patch of Fian began to grow. It is flowing, in the dark, under its own weight. Your body flows in the same way during sleep, not plastically, not through the deformation of crystal lattices, but through the specific, slow, pressure-driven movement of fluids through the tissues of a body that has released the muscular tension of wakefulness and is allowing the forces that were being held in check by that tension to express themselves. The cerebrospinal fluid flowing through the widened glymphatic channels. The blood redistributing from the periphery toward the core as the vascular tone shifts in the sleep state. The lymphatic fluid draining through the lymph nodes. The interstitial fluid returning from the tissues to the circulation. All of it flowing under the pressure that gravity and the body's own biological architecture provide. In the dark, while you rest. Now consider the specific colors of ice, the specific optical properties of glacial ice that make it, in its most compressed and most ancient form, unmistakably, irreducibly, extraordinarily blue. Fresh snow is white because the air trapped between the snow crystal scatters all wavelengths of visible light equally. The same physical mechanism that makes sea foam white and clouds white and any other material whose optical properties are dominated by the scattering of light from many small air-water interfaces. Fresh snow is nearly all air. The scattering is nearly total. The light that enters a fresh snowpack exits as white. Old glacial ice is blue because the air is gone. The compression that converts Fian to ice drives out the air pockets that were doing the scattering. In their absence, the optical properties of the ice itself, the pure, dense, crystal-clear H2O with no air inclusions, dominate, and pure water ice absorbs red light preferentially over blue light. The more ice a photon of light passes through before it is either absorbed or scattered back to the observer, the more of the red wavelengths have been absorbed, and the more the remaining light is enriched in the blue wavelengths that the ice absorbs less efficiently. The blue of glacial ice is the color of depth. The deeper the ice, the more red light has been absorbed, the more intensely blue the remaining light appears. A crevasse wall in a glacier, the exposed cross-section of decades or centuries of accumulated ice, cut open by the glacier's movement across uneven terrain, glows in the specific, deep, saturated blue of a material that has had all its redness consumed by depth. Detectives looking at the spectral properties of glacial ice at different depths and ages, using optical spectrometers, revealed that the blue color intensifies not only with depth but with age, with a progressive elimination of air bubbles and the growth of larger ice crystals over centuries of metamorphism. The oldest, most compressed, most metamorphosed ice, the ice at the base of the East Antarctic sheet, 2.7 million years old, is optically the most blue. The youngest, shallowest, least compressed ice, the ice near the surface of a recently formed alpine glacier, is nearly white. The blue is the color of time. The deeper you look into a glacier, the further back in time you are looking. The blue light that emerges from a glacier crevasse has passed through ice that was snow during the last ice age, during the Roman Empire, during the medieval warm period, during the Little Ice Age. The red light that those periods' snowflakes originally carried has been absorbed, layer by layer, century by century, in the progressive accumulation of ice above the layer you are looking at. The glacier shows you time as color, white at the surface, recent, young, compressed but not yet ancient, blue at depth, old, dense, carrying in its crystal structure the specific isotopic signature of the atmosphere of the year it fell, the specific temperature signal of the summer it survived, the specific chemistry of the air that was trapped in its bubbles before the compression drove it out. And at the deepest, oldest, most compressed layers, a blue so intense that it approaches purple. A color that has no good equivalent in the normal visual experience of a world that has not been looking at 2.7-million-year-old ice. The color of patience made visible. Your own body carries a version of this depth-color relationship in its tissues. The specific color of oxygenated blood, the bright red of arterial blood, versus the specific color of deoxygenated blood, the darker, bluer red of venous blood, reflects exactly the same principle as the white-to-blue transition of glacial ice. Oxygenated hemoglobin absorbs different wavelengths than deoxygenated hemoglobin. The color of your blood tells you, at a glance, whether the oxygen it was carrying has been delivered. The color is information. In the glacier, in your veins, both telling the story of what has been consumed, of what the depth has taken, of what remains. The accumulation zone of a glacier, the high basin where the snow falls and the firn accumulates and the ice is born, is, in its geography and its ecology, one of the most silent places on Earth. Not the silence of absence, the silence of accumulation. The silence of a place where the primary process is not dramatic or visible or audible but internal, happening within the snowpack, within the firn, within the crystal structure of the forming ice, in the dark below the surface of the white. No wind carves the accumulation zone. No river cuts it. No organism of any size inhabits the deepest layers of the firn. Just snow arriving, compressing, waiting, becoming, in the dark below the surface. Patiently. A glacier does not simply sit in a valley. It redesigns one. The valley that the glacier occupies before the ice arrives is a river valley, V-shaped in cross-section, narrow at the floor, widening upward to the ridgelines on either side, its walls angled by the specific erosional geometry of running water cutting downward through rock under the pull of gravity. The river's erosion is focused at its bed, the line of maximum velocity, the place where the water moves fastest and therefore removes rock most efficiently. The valley it produces reflects this focused erosion, deep at the center, shallowing toward the sides, the characteristic V that any geomorphologist can identify as the signature of liquid water at work. The glacier arrives, and the V becomes a U. Not immediately, not in any time frame that a human observer watching from a convenient vantage point could detect. Over thousands of years, the glacier filling the valley floor, extending its ice up the valley walls to the height of its own surface, applying its weight and its abrasive power not only to the valley floor beneath it, but to the walls on either side, rounding the sharp lower angles of the V into the broad, flat-floored, steep-walled curve of the glaciated valley. The U-shaped valley is the glacier's autobiography. Every mountain landscape that shows U-shaped valleys, the Scottish Highlands, the Norwegian fjords, the Alps, the Rockies, the Himalayas, the Southern Alps of New Zealand, was carved by glaciers. Not by rivers, not by tectonics, not by any process other than the specific, floor widening, wall steepening, base flattening erosion that a glacier performs as it moves through a landscape. And the mechanism of that erosion is one of the most powerful and most patient geological forces the Earth produces. The glacier erodes its bed through two simultaneous processes. The first is abrasion. The base of a moving glacier is not clean ice. It is a mixture of ice and rock, a layer of debris-laden ice in which fragments of rock torn from the bedrock below are embedded in the ice matrix and dragged across the bedrock surface by the glacier's movement. The rock fragments, ranging in size from fine clay particles to boulders the size of houses, act as the teeth of an enormous, slow-moving grinding wheel, scratching and polishing and removing material from the bedrock surface at rates that are, individually, microscopic but, accumulated over centuries, transform the landscape. The scratches that the embedded rock fragments leave on the bedrock surface are called striations, parallel grooves in the rock surface that record the direction of the glacier's movement with a precision that allows geologists to reconstruct the flow direction of glaciers that disappeared 10,000 years ago. Detectives looking at the striations on the exposed bedrock surfaces of formerly glaciated landscapes in North America and Europe revealed that the glacier's movement direction was, in many areas, different from the direction of the valleys it eventually carved, indicating that the glacier's flow was controlled not by the pre-existing topography alone but by the dynamics of the ice sheet itself, which moved under the influence of its own pressure gradient rather than simply following the landscape it found. The glacier went where its own weight took it, not where the landscape suggested. This is the first expression of the glacier's indifference to the landscape it encounters. The river follows the valley. The glacier, if it is large enough and thick enough, reshapes the valley to follow the glacier. The pre-glacial landscape is not the constraint within which the glacier operates. It is the material from which the glacier builds the post-glacial landscape. The second erosional process is plucking, or quarrying, where the glacier's base passes over an irregularity in the bedrock, a projecting knob of harder rock, a joint in the bedrock where two rock masses meet at an angle. The ice on the downstream side of the irregularity can exert a tensile stress on the bedrock that, if the rock's tensile strength is exceeded, fractures and removes blocks of rock from the bedrock surface. The removed blocks are incorporated into the glacier's base layer and become the tools of further abrasion. The plucking that removes them leaves the downstream face of the irregularity as a rough, jagged cliff. The specific asymmetry that produces the roches moutonnées, the sheepback rocks that dot formerly glaciated landscapes and whose smooth upstream faces and rough downstream faces record, in the specific geometry of their asymmetry, the direction of the glacier's movement. Together, abrasion and plucking, the glacier removes material from its bed at rates of between 1 and 10 mm per year, depending on the thickness and the velocity of the ice and the hardness of the underlying rock. 1 to 10 mm per year. Over 10,000 years, the duration of a single glacial advance in the Pleistocene, 1 to 10 mm per year produces 1 to 100 meters of erosion. 100 meters of rock removed from the floor of a valley in 10,000 years. By ice. The Scottish lochs, the deep, dark, cold freshwater lakes that fill the floors of the U-shaped valleys that the glaciers of the last ice age carved through the highlands, are sitting in basins that the glaciers excavated below sea level before the ice retreated and the meltwater filled the carved troughs. Loch Ness, the most famous of them, is 327 meters deep at its deepest point, 327 meters of dark water, above a loch bed that the glacier cut below the level of the surrounding sea. 327 meters, the height of the Eiffel Tower, measured downward into rock that was once solid mountainside, cut by ice moving at the pace of a very slow fingernail, 1 millimeter at a time, for 10,000 years. The patience of the glacier produces depths that no sudden force could achieve. Your own body has been shaped by the same patient erosion, not by ice, but by the specific, cumulative, millimeter by millimeter modification of your neural architecture by experience. Each significant experience, each relationship, each failure, each achievement, each loss, does not immediately and dramatically reshape the neural circuits that encode your personality and your behavior. It modifies them by fractions, strengthens some connections by the specific synaptic potentiation that repeated activation produces, weakens others by the synaptic depression that disuse produces, leaves its trace, as the glacier leaves its striation, not in any single dramatic transformation, but in the accumulated direction of thousands of small modifications, each one imperceptible, all of them together constituting the specific, irreversible, personal geology of the person you have become. Experience is the glacier. Your neural architecture is the valley, and the U-shape that emerges from the process, the broad, deepened, smooth floor version of the person you are becoming, is the product not of any single event but of the patient, cumulative, directional work of years of living in a specific landscape with specific conditions. Now follow the meltwater, the water that the glacier produces at its margins, from the ablation zone where the summer melting exceeds the winter accumulation, from the subglacial meltwater streams that run under the glacier's base where geothermal heat and pressure melting keep water flowing even in the coldest conditions, from the marginal lakes that collect in the depressions between the glacier's edge and the valley walls, is not simply the glacier's waste product. It is one of the most chemically active waters on Earth. Glacial meltwater is cold, typically near 0 degrees Celsius, and it is heavily loaded with the fine rock powder that the glacier's abrasion produces. This rock powder, called rock flour or glacial flour, is ground to a particle size of less than 2 micrometers in the glacier's abrasion zone, fine enough to remain in suspension in the meltwater for hours or days before settling. It gives glacial lakes and glacial rivers their characteristic color, the milky turquoise that you see in the photographs of the lakes in Banff and the rivers of Iceland and the fjords of Patagonia, a color produced by the suspension of rock flour particles in the water that scatter short-wavelength blue-green light preferentially in the same physical mechanism that makes the sky blue. The color of the glacial lake is the color of rock flour, the color of ground mountain, the color of the glacier's work made visible in the water that carries it away. And the rock flour that the glacier produces is the foundation of some of the most fertile soils on Earth. The specific mineral content of rock flour, the trace elements and the fresh mineral surfaces that the glacier's grinding exposes before any chemical weathering has modified them, provides a nutritional richness to the soil that forms from it that few other geological processes can match. The glacial outwash plains, the flat, sandy, rock flour-rich plains that extend downslope from the glacier's terminal moraine, built from the material that the meltwater rivers deposited as they slowed and spread, are among the most agriculturally productive landscapes in the world. The wheat fields of the American Midwest grow in glacial outwash. The farmland of southern Scandinavia grows in glacial outwash. The fertile floodplains of the Rhine and the Thames grow in sediment that the glaciers of the last ice age ground from the mountains and deposited as outwash on the lowland plains that the retreating ice left behind. The food that sustains the populations of the northern hemisphere grows, in large part, in the flour that the glaciers ground from the mountains. Your body is built from glacial rock flour. Not metaphorically, chemically. The calcium in your bones, the phosphorus in your DNA, the potassium in your nerve cells, all of them traced back, through the food chain and the soil, to the mineral wealth that the glacier's abrasion liberated from bedrock that rain alone could never have processed quickly enough to sustain the specific agricultural productivity that the post-glacial landscapes of the northern hemisphere have provided for the last 10,000 years of human civilization. The glacier ground your bones, 1 millimeter at a time, over 10,000 years. Now consider what the glacier deposits when it stops moving, the specific material record that the terminus of a glacier leaves in the landscape when the ice retreats. The terminal moraine, the ridge of unsorted debris, boulders the size of cars mixed with sand and clay and the rock flour that the abrasion zone produced, piled up at the farthest point of the glacier's advance. The terminal moraine is the glacier's greatest reach, the furthest extent of the ice, the specific line in the landscape that marks the moment when the glacier's mass balance, the relationship between accumulation at the top and melting at the bottom, shifted from positive to negative, and the advance became a retreat. Every terminal moraine tells you where the glacier's ambition ended, and how large it was. The terminal moraine of the Laurentide ice sheet, the glacier that covered most of North America at the last glacial maximum 20,000 years ago, runs across the landscape of North America from Long Island to the Ohio River to Montana, a ridge of glacial debris that marks the southern limit of an ice sheet that was, at its peak, 3 kilometers thick above what is now Chicago, and that covered approximately 13 million square kilometers of the North American continent. The ridge runs through suburban neighborhoods, through farmland, through the foundations of houses whose owners have no reason to know they are living on the southern boundary of the most recent ice age. The glacier left its mark here, in the unsorted pile of a ridge that the ice never crossed, a permanent record of the furthest the cold ever reached. And everywhere on the downslope side of that ridge, in the outwash plains and the river terraces and the lake sediments and the soil profiles of the temperate regions that the ice shaped but did not bury, the glacier's work persists. In the fertility of the fields, in the depth of the lakes, in the specific, smooth-floored, steep-walled topography of every valley that was once a glacier's channel. The glacier is gone. The world it made is still here, as it will be for millions of years after the last glacier melts. Because the carving is permanent. Because the patience of the ice made something that no subsequent process will undo on any timescale that the living world can hold. The U-shaped valley does not go back to V-shaped when the ice retreats. It stays as the specific, irreversible, geologically permanent record of the glacier that made it. As your neural architecture stays reshaped by the experiences that modified it. As the body stays different, always slightly, from what it was before the thing that changed it. The glacier is gone. The shape remains. On the 18th of August 2019, a funeral was held in Iceland for a glacier. Not a metaphorical funeral. Not a protest event designed around the imagery of death. A formal, attended, eulogized ceremony at which approximately 100 people gathered on the barren hillside of Borgafjörður in western Iceland and fixed a memorial plaque to the bare rock that had, until approximately 15 years earlier, been covered by the Arctical Glacier, the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier, downgraded from glacier to dead ice in 2014, when it thinned below the 50-meter depth required for the plastic deformation that defines a glacier as a glacier rather than simply a body of permanent ice. The plaque reads, in Icelandic and in English, "A letter to the future." OK is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all our glaciers are expected to follow the same path. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. Only you know if we did it. A letter to the future, written in bronze, fixed to the bare rock of what was once a glacier. The catastrophe of the world's retreating glaciers is not a future projection. It is a current measurement, documented in the specific, quantitative, instrument-verified records of glacier length and mass balance and albedo and meltwater discharge that glaciologists have been maintaining in the world's major glaciated regions since the mid-20th century. Those records show, with a consistency and a precision that leaves no reasonable room for alternative interpretation, that the world's glaciers are losing mass. Every major glaciated region on Earth, the European Alps, the Himalayas, the Andes, the Rockies, Greenland, Antarctica, is showing net negative mass balance. The accumulation of ice in the cold months is no longer keeping pace with the melting in the warm months. The balance that allowed the first surviving snowflake to begin the process of becoming a glacier is tipping in the other direction. The ice is leaving. Not all of it. Not everywhere at the same rate. The East Antarctic ice sheet, in the cold, dry interior where the ice is oldest and the accumulation rates are lowest, is losing mass more slowly than the peripheral ice sheets and the mountain glaciers. Some glaciers in specific regions, the interior of Greenland, some high Himalayan catchments, are, in specific years under specific conditions, still gaining mass. The catastrophe is not uniform, but the direction is. Detectives looking at the global glacier mass balance record compiled by the World Glacier Monitoring Service, the most comprehensive long-term dataset of glacier change available, incorporating measurements from hundreds of glaciers on 6 continents conducted over periods of up to 150 years, revealed a trend that is, in its consistency and its acceleration, unlike anything in the instrumental record. The average global glacier lost approximately half a meter of water-equivalent thickness per year between 1980 and 2010, a rate that has been accelerating in the most recent decades to approximately 1 meter of water-equivalent thickness per year in the 2010s. 1 meter of water-equivalent thickness per year. For a mountain glacier that is 100 meters thick, a relatively modest alpine glacier by global standards, 1 meter per year of water equivalent loss means the glacier is losing approximately 1% of its thickness annually. At that rate, a 100-meter glacier has approximately 100 years before it is gone. A 50-meter glacier has 50 years. A 20-meter glacier, the size of many of the smaller alpine glaciers that were thriving in photographs from the early 20th century, has approximately 20 years. And the glacier cannot be replaced on a human timescale. The firn to ice transition takes 25 to hundreds of years under typical conditions. The accumulation of 100 meters of firn that will eventually become 100 meters of ice requires, at typical alpine accumulation rates of 1 to 2 meters of snow per year, between 50 and 100 years of uninterrupted net positive mass balance. A glacier that loses its last ice this decade cannot be rebuilt in the next decade, or the next century, or possibly the next millennium, not because the physics has changed, but because the climate that allowed the original glacier to persist has changed. The conditions that gave the first snowflake a chance of surviving its first summer are no longer reliable. The monster of glacial retreat is not the retreat itself, not the shortening of the terminus, not the thinning of the ice, not even the eventual disappearance of the glacier as a discrete glaciological feature. The monster is the function that the retreating glacier was performing and that its absence will eliminate, the specific hydrological, ecological, and climatic functions that glaciers have been performing for millions of years and that the landscapes and the populations downstream have organized themselves around. The glacier as a water tower. The metaphor is not casual. The glaciers of the high mountain regions, the Hindu Kush Himalaya, the Tibetan Plateau, the Andes, the Alps, are the primary seasonal water storage systems for approximately 2 billion people who live downstream of them. The meltwater that flows from these glaciers in summer, when the winter's snowpack has already melted but the rivers are fed by the summer ablation of the glacial ice, is the specific, reliable, seasonally timed water supply that the agricultural systems of South Asia and Central Asia and the Western Americas depend on for the irrigation of crops in the months when precipitation is lowest. The glacier delivers water when the rain does not. That is its function, from the perspective of the human populations downstream. And as the glaciers thin and retreat, the pattern of meltwater delivery is changing, in ways that are, in the short term, increasing the meltwater flow as the accelerated melting produces more runoff than the pre-retreat ice was releasing, and that will be, in the medium to long term, catastrophically reducing that flow as the ice that was producing the runoff is gone. This is the peak water problem. The moment at which a glacier's retreat passes through the phase of maximum meltwater production. The moment when the increased rate of melting is producing more water per year than the glacier ever produced at its stable, equilibrium rate, and begins the long decline toward the day when the glacier is too small to produce significant meltwater, and the summer river flows in the downstream catchments drop to whatever the summer rainfall alone can sustain. For the major glacier-fed rivers of the Hindu Kush Himalaya, the Indus, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Yangtze, the Yellow River, peak water is projected to occur in the glacier-fed components of their flows, sometime in the mid to late 21st century for most of the relevant glaciers, and may already have occurred for some of the smaller ones. Approximately 2 billion people live in the basins of these rivers. 2 billion people, whose agricultural systems and whose municipal water supplies and whose hydroelectric power generation depend, in their summer flow components, on the meltwater from glaciers that are retreating at 1 meter of water-equivalent thickness per year. The scale of this is not easily held. 2 billion people. 150 years. 1 meter per year. The waterhole that the matriarch knows is drying. And unlike the elephant's waterhole, which can potentially recover when the drought breaks, when the rains return, when the conditions that dried it are reversed, the glacier's contribution to the river system is not recoverable on a human timescale once the ice is gone. The water that the glacier was holding for you was accumulated over centuries to millennia of net positive mass balance, over centuries of summers that were cold enough and winters that were deep enough and accumulation zones that were high enough that the ice grew faster than it melted. Restoring that accumulation requires not just a cooler summer but centuries of cooler summers, sustained long enough for the firn to accumulate and compress and convert to ice and reach the thickness at which the glacier's mass balance is genuinely positive again. The wonder without anxiety reframe of this movement is not the denial of the catastrophe. It is the recognition, the specific, historically grounded, geologically informed recognition, that the Earth's glacier systems have retreated and advanced before. That the ice ages of the Pleistocene produced enormous glaciers from conditions that were, in their basic physics, the same as the conditions that produce glaciers today. Cooler summers, persistent firn, the patient accumulation of snow that survives season after season until it becomes ice. That the warming that ended each glacial period and retreated the ice was itself followed, after the appropriate orbital forcing, by the next cooling and the next advance. The glaciers have always come back. Not on human timescales. On the orbital timescales of the Milankovitch cycles, the 20,000-year and 40,000-year and 100,000-year cycles of the Earth's orbital parameters that we explored in the Ice Age script. On those timescales, the current retreat is a phase in a cycle that has been running for 2.5 million years. But here, in the human present, the retreat is real and its consequences are immediate, and the 2 billion people downstream of the Hindu Kush Himalayan glaciers cannot wait for the next orbital cycle to begin. The response that is already underway, the engineering of alternative water storage, the modification of irrigation systems to work with lower peak flows, the development of drought-resistant crop varieties, the specific adaptation strategies that the communities most affected by glacier retreat are already implementing with a practicality and a creativity that large-scale crisis consistently produces, is the human equivalent of the organism that survives the younger dryas by reorganizing its behavior around the new constraints. The crisis is real. The response is happening. And in the glaciated landscapes where the retreat has been most carefully monitored and most actively managed, the Swiss Alps, the Peruvian Andes, the New Zealand Southern Alps, the specific combination of international research, local knowledge, community adaptation, and the political will to treat glacier retreat as the infrastructure emergency it is has produced responses that are, within their specific scope, working, not solving the long-term problem, managing the immediate consequences. As every successful response to every geological catastrophe in this series has managed its immediate consequences, by the specific, practical, locally adapted application of whatever knowledge and resources are available, while the longer-term processes continue their unhurried work. The ice is leaving, as it has always, eventually, left. The world it made is still here, and the world that will exist after the ice is gone, shaped by the carving and the grinding and the meltwater and the rock flour of the glaciers that are retreating, will bear, in every U-shaped valley and every glacial lake and every stretch of fertile outwash plain, the permanent record of the ice's long, patient work. The glacier will be gone. The shape it made will remain, as it always has, as it always will. There is glacial ice in your body right now. Not literally, not the specific ice crystals of a specific glacier, which are currently in the process of melting into the rivers and the ocean and the atmosphere that will eventually redistribute their water through the hydrological cycle that has been running since the Earth first had water to cycle. But the water, the specific water molecules that left a glacier at some point in the last decade or the last century and entered the river and the reservoir and the treatment plant and the pipe and the tap and the glass in your blood. You are drinking the glacier. Your blood contains water that was firn in the Alps 10 years ago. That was glacial ice in the Himalayas 50 years ago. That was snow on a mountain in New Zealand 100 years ago, compressed into the firn layer that the following decade's snowfall drove deeper, that the decade after that snowfall drove deeper still, until the air pockets were gone and the crystals had grown large and the material had become the dense, blue, 200-year-old ice that the meltwater of the current decade has released into the river that feeds the watershed, that feeds the reservoir, that feeds the pipe, that feeds your glass. The water in your body is old, not ancient, not 2.7 million-year-old East Antarctic deep ice, not Pleistocene ice whose crystal structure was locked before modern humans existed, but old in the human sense. Old enough to have been snow when the people who would become your grandparents were children. Old enough to have been firn when the century turned. Old enough that its oxygen isotope ratio carries the specific atmospheric signature of a climate that was measurably different, cooler, drier, with a different concentration of greenhouse gases, from the climate in which the glacier is releasing it today. Your blood carries the isotopic signature of a colder world. Detectives looking at the oxygen isotope ratios of water in the blood of populations living downstream of retreating glaciers revealed something that connects the glacier's 200-year age to the specific chemistry of the water circulating through your body right now. The delta superscript 1 ratio, the ratio of heavy oxygen, 18 to standard oxygen, 16 in a water molecule, is set at the moment the water evaporates from the ocean and falls as precipitation. It records the temperature of the atmosphere at the time and place of precipitation. Water that fell as snow in a colder climate has a more negative delta superscript 10 value than water that falls today in a warmer climate. The glacier releases old snow with the isotopic signature of the colder climate it fell in. That old snow becomes the meltwater. The meltwater becomes the river. The river becomes the reservoir. The reservoir becomes your water supply. And the specific isotopic character of the water, its faint, instrument-detectable, chemically preserved record of the temperature of the world when it fell as snow, passes into your body. You carry the cold world's signature in your blood, as the glacier carries it in its ice. Both archives, both records, both preserving, in their chemistry, the specific conditions of the world at the time the water was locked away from the hydrological cycle. The glacier's ice is an archive of past climate. Your blood is an archive of the water that fed you. Now follow the transformation, not the glacier's transformation from snow to firn to ice, which we followed in movement 2, but the analogous transformation that is happening in you right now, in the dark, in the specific biological metamorphism of a body transitioning from wakefulness to sleep. The firn to ice transition takes years. The wakefulness to sleep transition takes minutes. But the principle is the same. Fresh snow, the waking state, high in energy, full of the neural activity that corresponds to the air trapped in fresh snow, firing at high frequencies, attending to the world outside, maintaining the complex social and environmental monitoring of a conscious primate. Light, full of space, not yet compressed into anything permanent. The firn, the transitional state, the hypnagogic zone, the specific threshold experience of the mind that is no longer quite awake and not yet fully asleep. The neural activity slowing, the thoughts losing their sharp crystal arms, the images of the day dissolving into the looser, less structured associations of the pre-sleep mind. Denser than wakefulness. Quieter. The air pockets of conscious attention beginning to close. The glacial ice. Deep sleep. The slow, large, coherent oscillations of stage 3 sleep. The delta waves that represent the most synchronized, most consolidated, most deeply organized electrical activity that the waking brain never produces. Dense. Continuous. Not a collection of separate firing events, but a whole brain rhythm, the neural equivalent of the single crystal that the firn grains grow into under sufficient pressure and time. The glacier is born when the firn becomes ice. Sleep is born when the hypnagogic state becomes stage 3. Both transitions require the same precondition, the removal of the air. Not literally. Your brain's transition into deep sleep does not involve the physical removal of anything from anywhere, but the functional equivalent, the removal of the specific, distributed, outward-attending neural activity that constitutes the waking brain's version of the air in fresh snow, the monitoring, the planning, the social processing, the continuous environmental scanning that keeps the waking brain light and porous and responsive to the world outside the skull. When that activity slows, when the thalamus gates the incoming sensory signals and the arousal systems down-regulate and the specific neural populations associated with waking consciousness reduce their firing rate, the brain becomes denser, more coherent, more like the solid, crystalline, whole-brain synchronized electrical activity of deep sleep. The air is gone. The firn is becoming ice. Your brain is approaching the glacial state right now. Not fully there yet, but moving. The specific, measurable, electroencephalographically distinct stages of the sleep onset process unfolding in sequence. The alpha waves of relaxed wakefulness already present, the theta waves of Stage 1 sleep beginning to appear, the K-complexes of Stage 2 not far away, the large slow delta waves of Stage 3 waiting at the far end of the transition. The transformation is underway. The weight of the day is doing what the weight of new snow does to the year before Fionn, pressing it down, closing the air pockets, driving it toward the density that produces coherence. And in that coherence, in the large, slow, synchronized electrical rhythms of deep sleep, the brain does what the glacier does in its deep, blue, ancient ice. It stores. It records. It consolidates the experiences of the day into the long-term archive that will persist after the sleep ends, just as the glacier consolidates the atmospheric chemistry of the year's snowfall into the ice archive that will persist after the snow surface has been buried by the following winter's accumulation. The memory consolidation of sleep is the glacier's annual layering. Each night's sleep adds a new layer to the archive, compresses the day's experience into a denser, more efficiently stored, longer-lasting form, drives out the transient details that are the neural equivalent of air pockets in fresh snow, preserves the essential signal, the core memory, the important learning, the significant emotional experience, in the crystal structure of long-term memory. The glacier of your memory is building, layer by layer, one night at a time. Tonight's layer is being deposited now, in the dark, in the cold of deep sleep that is approaching. Detectives looking at the neurological process of sleep-dependent memory consolidation using MRI and EEG recordings from sleeping subjects revealed that the hippocampal replay that consolidates the day's experiences into long-term memory, the fast-forward of the day's navigation routes and social encounters and significant events that the hippocampus conducts during slow-wave sleep, occurs preferentially during the slow oscillations of Stage 3 sleep. The most important memory consolidation happens in the deepest sleep. The densest ice preserves the clearest record. The glacier's oldest, most compressed ice carries the clearest climate signal. Your brain's deepest, most synchronized sleep produces the most durable memory consolidation. Both systems, the deeper, the more preserved. Both systems, the more compressed, the more durable. Both systems, the more the air is removed, the more the record is clear. If this journey through the birth and the life and the geological work and the retreating present and the ancient water of the world's glaciers has been useful to you tonight, if this slow hour of cold patience and deep time and the specific, unhurried, annual layer by annual layer process of snow becoming Fionn, becoming ice, becoming landscape has helped the day's activity settle into the density of tonight's rest, then I would gently invite you to subscribe, or to leave a thought below about which part of this stayed with you longest. Whether it was the first snowflake surviving its first summer, or the blue of the ancient ice showing you time as color, or the U-shaped valley that the glacier carved and then left behind as its permanent autobiography, or the plaque fixed to the bare rock of the first Icelandic glacier to disappear, or simply the knowledge that the water in your blood tonight was snow on a mountain before your grandparents were born. It helps other people find their way here, other bodies of water in the dark, also in the process of becoming denser, also adding tonight's layer to the archive, one snowflake at a time. And if sleep is still arriving slowly, if the Fionn is still porous, still light, still holding air that hasn't yet been driven out by the weight of the day, there is another journey waiting, another slow geological process, another piece of deep time told at this same unhurried pace, in this same quiet voice, carrying you somewhere colder and older and more patient than anything that needed to be done today. It will be there when you need it. But for now, feel the weight of your body where it meets the surface beneath you. This is the weight that the glacier uses, not the sudden, dramatic weight of a rockfall or an avalanche. The patient, continuous, irreversible weight of mass pressing on mass over time, the weight that drives the air from the Fionn, the weight that converts the loose and separate into the dense and continuous, the weight that produces, eventually, the blue and ancient and clear recording ice. Your weight, on this surface, tonight, pressing down, driving out the air pockets of the day. Allow your shoulders to soften now. The way the fresh snow settles under the weight of the snow above it. Not suddenly, not all at once, but continuously, imperceptibly, the grains moving into the configuration that the weight requires. Let the specific tension that holding the day upright demanded release into the surface beneath you. Let the surface do what surfaces do. Hold you, without effort, without judgment. Allow your jaw to unclench. Allow your hands to open. Allow the thoughts that are still carrying the day's sharp crystal arms, still branched and symmetrical and specific in the way that fresh snow crystals are, to begin the metamorphism, to round their edges, to lose the fine structure that the day gave them, to become the smoother, denser, less individually detailed forms that the Fearn stage requires before the ice can form. The day is becoming Fearn. The Fearn is becoming ice. The ice is becoming the archive. Right now, somewhere on a high mountain, a snowflake that fell this morning has not melted. It landed on the previous winter's snow. It settled. It began, without any awareness of what it was beginning, without any knowledge of the glacier it might eventually become, the first stage of the transformation that patience and wait and time will complete. You are that snowflake tonight, settled on the accumulation of everything that came before, beginning the transformation that the night requires. Let the weight press. Let the air leave. Let the ice form in the dark. Nothing needs to stay light tonight. Nothing needs to keep its shape. The glacier is being born. In the quiet. In the cold. In the blue dark of becoming. Sleep well. And good night.